Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody tonight. Just give people a couple of minutes to come into Facebook and YouTube. I think we're live everywhere. Yep. And a few more people coming in on Zoom. I hope everyone's had a nice week. You like my hat? I'm testing out the hat with the hair. So let me know what you think of the hat with the hair, because I'm planning to wear this for Inauguration Day. So I think the hat works well. Take a look from the side, the other side. It's pretty good. Tied in the back. I mastered that. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes to see who else comes in tonight. And while we're waiting, I'm going to just share a screen with you. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, or someone would have been saying by now we can't hear you. So I have trouble with this mic sometimes. So if my sound disappears, send me a little note or a chat and tell me you're not hearing me, and I'll switch to a different. Oh, the hair. Thank you. Art out in Setauket for the hair. I love the hair. It's the best. I'll be wearing this wig all summer, I think, from the new Mrs. Q. Let's see, Mrs. McCabe says she likes the hat. Well, it does tie. There is a ribbon. Let me see if I can show you. There is a ribbon here, and I happen to have it tied under this massive amount of hair, and the big poof of hair holds the bow in place. So it's working out pretty well. So I like it. And for the time period that I'm aiming for, this is the appropriate hat to wear with the hair, the straw hat. So so I'll be working on that. How I'm going to keep it on outside without it blowing off, that could be another story, but I'll have to pin it on really well so I don't lose it. Let's see. Oh, lots of people here. Thank you all. I want to apologize to everyone for last week. Those of you who wanted to watch me on the Queens Public Library lecture that I do every month, they had technical problems at the Queens Library, and even I was not able to sign into the WebEx meeting. So these things happen once in a while. I've been working with them for many, many years. This is the first time there's ever been a mishap. So, that's all right. And that talk on Theodosia Burr Alston has been rescheduled for mid-April, and I'll let you know what that date is. I think that's going to be an afternoon rather than my usual Friday, 10 a.m. And then I think the following Friday morning, I'm going to talk about Hamilton and Burr. So it'll be a fun couple of weeks on that lecture that I do for the Queens Library. So for those of you who don't already know, I'm going to share a screen with you just for a moment. Coming up, April 30th is going to be our Inauguration Day Tour with my friend Kyle Jenks, who will be playing James Madison. And we hope you'll come out and join us either live in person in Lower Manhattan, or that you'll get a live stream ticket and join us via the live stream. It's going to be great fun. Mr. Madison and I and Mrs. Van R will be walking through the town as it was on Inauguration Day and letting you know all about what was going on. And we will also be telling you, oh, wait, I want to end the stream. I want to end the share. And I can't find the button to end the share. There it is. Sorry about that. Don't mean to be so silly. We'll be talking about everything going on in the town. And I will be speaking to Mr. Madison along the tour route about what kind of government the Constitution gives us, and how we got the Constitution and how it got ratified in the Bill of Rights. And we'll be including a lot of really fun stories about the Constitution that many people don't know. And we'll be culminating with Washington's inauguration at Federal Hall. And I do believe the president will be joining us there for his inauguration. If you've been following me on social media, yesterday I posted that Trinity and St. Paul's churches and graveyards reopened yesterday after a 2-year closure. And I right away sent Rector Jackson, who is an old friend of mine, an email asking if we could be allowed to go into the sanctuary on our Inauguration Day tour, as that was where Washington's inaugural service was held. I'm waiting to hear back from him, but I doubt very much that the response would be anything but affirmative, as he loves the history of the church as much as we all do. So I am keeping my fingers crossed and hoping, that we'll get some maybe help from above and be able to go into the sanctuary where that inaugural service was held on our tour. So if you don't have tickets, please get tickets for the tour. We're going to have a great time. If you're in the New York City area and you don't want to come into the city because of how bad it is, Lower Manhattan is not bad like Midtown. I've been out nearly every day for the past 2 weeks doing tours, and I've had no problems. I haven't had to step over anybody laying in the street. Nobody has accosted the tour. I take the subway back and forth, and I've been fine. And I know that you see a lot of bad news, but a lot of that is happening either in Midtown or in neighborhoods that are far from where we're having the tour. Downtown is in very good condition. A lot of people live there. They're out and about. People are back to work, although they won't be on a Saturday. And there are a lot of tour groups going through the area as well. So I encourage you to come in on April 30th for a wonderful event commemorating our first inaugural service. We'll all be dressed up. You can ask us whatever questions, talk to us along the tour route. There is going to be a photographer on the tour, so we'll have photographs, and of course, there'll be the live stream for those of you who can't make it in person. We'll answer your questions as well. And let me just take a quick look at some of your messages here. Also, we have Philadelphia and Hudson Valley, Pennsylvania, of course, Setauket, Long Island, and many other places. So thank you for joining me. So today is April Fool's Day, of course. So I thought I would talk a little bit about fools and the idea of fools, and especially a tale, The Wise Fools of Gotham. I don't know if you're familiar with this tale. Now, this was eventually applied to the people of New York, which is how we will get our name, Gotham City. I'll tell you how that happened and who was behind that. But The Wise Fools of Gotham is a tale told in my time. Mrs. Van Aaren learned it and I learned it when we were little girls. And you might remember the nursery rhyme, rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub. And who do you think they'd be? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all set out for sea. And this is a part of the idea of the Wise Fools of Gotham. And the story goes that during the reign of King John and his entourage were moving through Nottingham, and the town of Gotham either refused to let them pass on their roads or refused to let them into their town and closed up the gate and boarded it up. I've heard both versions of this story, but at any rate, the people of Gotham forbade the king and his entourage from passing or entering. The belief being that if the king moved along their private roads, they would then now become public roads, and they would have to support these public roads for everyone. And that would be the story as if they were passing in front. And the story, if they were entering the town, that they would then have to support the king and his entourage while they stayed at their own expense, which of course they also didn't want to do. So either way, this is not wanting to pay for the king and his entourage. So the king, upset with the people of Gotham, dispatched the sheriff, who would be, of course, the sheriff of Nottingham, to Gotham to see what was going on. And when the sheriff arrived, the people were all acting insane. They were talking backwards, walking backwards, rolling stones uphill. And they said also rolling cheeses downhill and aiming them toward the town so that they would reach the town from the top of the hill. But in many respects, acting crazy and insane, standing on their heads, things like that. And that the sheriff tried to reason with them and could not get them to make any sense. And I suppose at that time, there was a fear that insanity was contagious. And frightened, he ran and left Gotham, and they left them where they were. So they became known as the Wise Fools of Gotham. And there are many more stories about this that add other things they were doing, but that is the story in a nutshell. So we might be able to say that New York in many ways seemed to be like the Wise Fools of Gotham. Aren't we, in many historical aspects? If you look at the history of our fine colony and town and later city and state, and some of the politics that to people outside seem impenetrable, weird, senseless or just plain crazy. Maybe some of the crazy things New York has done are not so crazy at all, but actually make sense when you understand the motivations for them. Oh, we have some additional people, Delaware and South Carolina. Excellent. And so let's start with some of the things New York has done over time to completely frustrate our friends in, let's say, at first, the other colonies. So we could, what shall we start with? Let's maybe start with the Stamp Act Congress, which you might recall in 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. And of course, we all were unhappy about that, paying a tax on paper to support the occupying armies of America. And the colonies, we all united against the Stamp Act, and we created that famous slogan that you still know, no taxation without representation, and ultimately joined up and refused to trade with England. That refusal to trade with England led to the successful repeal of the Stamp Act the following year. But in October of 1765, there was a Stamp Act Congress held in the city of New York, the first Congress of the colonies ever to be held. And it was a great event with people joining from most of the other colonies. 3 colonies had their governments dissolved by their royal governors, so they could not select people to come. One of those colonies was Virginia, but the others participated, all came to New York, and for 3 days met at our city hall and had a Stamp Act Congress, and actually came up with a document called the Resolves of the Stamp Act Congress. And remember that it was New York that called this Congress, New York who hosted the Congress, and in the end, it was New York that refused to sign the Resolves of the Stamp Act Congress, frustrating everyone who had attended. What kind of sense could that possibly make? Why would New York go to the extent of calling a Congress, participating in a Congress, and then refusing to sign the final document? Well, that puts New York in a very good position all around now, doesn't it? New York becomes heroic for calling the Congress and hosting it and participating in it. But we don't really burn our bridges with the crown by signing it, do we? So we still kind of stay in the good graces of both sides, playing both sides a little bit. So that's our first instance that we might be like the wise fools of Gotham, seeming to be ridiculous by not signing the document, yet still putting ourselves in a not bad political position by not doing so. So that's my first example for you. A second example, which probably is the most well-known example, would be the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure you all know we would not debate on, we would not vote on. We abstained from the votes, we abstained respectfully. And of course, our initial delegation that was there refused to sign the Declaration of Independence as well. So here we are again, seeming to be ridiculous in New York, because you might remember we hadn't torn down the statue of the king yet, but we had done plenty of other things, hadn't we? We had been dragging our Tories around the town, hanging them up by the seat of their pants on the Liberty pole, forcing them on their knees to damn the king. And we had other riots and confrontations, newspapers full of seditious articles about separating from the crown. And it seemed as though New York really was in the forefront of this idea to declare our independency. And then New York refused to vote or sign the document. And again, we seem rather foolish and ridiculous, but if you look at the position it put New York in, we were again looking quite good for all of our vocal opposition to the crown, but by not signing the declaration, we also didn't enrage the crown toward us, or at least that was the thinking at the time, that the city was so divided between Tories and Whigs, or loyalists and patriots, that by not voting on it and not signing it, it represented the divisions, the equal divisions of the town, and made neither side victorious and neither side a loser. So here we are looking rather foolish again, and have kind of a reason for looking that way. Someone says you can't have it both ways for too long. Oh, but New York continued to try, shall we say. So the war is over, and we now have, excuse me, our Constitution. And you might know that our delegation to the Constitutional Convention was completely against writing the Constitution, except Mr. Hamilton. The rest of the delegation felt that the Constitution was not proper, that the only instructions they had was to modify the Articles of Confederation. And you'll hear about this on the April 30th tour from Mr. Madison, as he was in the same position coming from Virginia, who felt that the only right they had was to modify the Articles of Confederation. And it was Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton together who were really the tip of that spear, so to speak, of rewriting, or I should say throwing out the document and creating a whole new one. So here we have New York again, who is against the Constitution. And hello to Michigan. Against the Constitution. And then it became time to ratify the Constitution. And you might know that New York was against ratification, although Hamilton and his faction were a very vocal faction. The majority of this colony or state were against ratification of the Constitution without it receiving massive changes. And we did have a ratification convention in Poughkeepsie, which we'll talk about also on the tour. Mr. Madison visited that convention. He'll have some interesting things to say about what was going on there. And the convention was completely overwhelmed by what you might call anti-federalists, people who were against the ratification unless there were major changes made to the Constitution. And at this time, we had already had a ratification parade with a ship with Mr. Hamilton's name on it, as it seemed that ratification was going to take place. But there were still some people who were opposed to it. And one person, the great Chancellor Livingston, who swore in George Washington as president, described this group who were against ratification as children blowing soap bubbles from their pipes, being childish. And one of the leaders of that own faction, Mr. Melancton Smith, described them as a flock of sheep grazing and wandering on a hilltop. So there's some funny ideas of that ratification convention. But New York would not ratify unless amendments were made. And you might know that those amendments were the Bill of Rights. So now New York, which may have seemed so ridiculous, and our refusal to go along with the Constitution, turns out was instrumental in adding those 10 very important amendments that secure our states against federal intrusion. So again, New York, maybe being some wise fools again there. And then we ratified our Constitution, and we had our elections for our House of Representatives, which you may remember voted unanimously for George Washington as our first president. That is unanimously, except for a couple of delegations who were not present. And one of those delegations, of course, being New York, because in New York, we were battling brutally over how the lines for those election districts would be drawn. That may sound familiar to you in 2022, arguing over how our lines would be drawn for, for allocation for our members of Congress. And we're arguing about it for such a long time. We missed that original first meeting of the federal Congress and did not vote for Washington as president, which of course meant that the New York delegation could not be blamed if everyone was angry at Washington as president. So New York could say, we didn't vote, so don't blame us for what he's done. Again, seeming foolish, but maybe not being so ridiculous in the end. So we have New York seeming to be ridiculous and not doing things that New York seems to be saying will do, but not actually coming around to do them. So a few of those examples, let me look at some of the comments here. Oh, Mr. Cipolla says he was a little late because he was doing housework. I was almost a little late myself, trying to get my hat affixed. Mrs. Van R is not here to help me with these things. And without Mrs. Van R, sometimes I just can't do anything properly without her guidance to help me with things. And of course, Mr. Q is useless at something like this. Speaking of Mr. Q, since he's not here, I can tell you this story. He is out right now because Mr. Q has taken up the odious habit of feeding the neighborhood raccoons, which means the raccoons are in all of our backyards, scaring people and digging through the garbage. And he's also feeding the squirrels, which are digging up everyone's spring gardening beds, including my own. So I'm not sure how many of the neighbors realize the culprit behind this is Mr. Q, but he is out right now. And I think a few people have caught on that he is the person doing this. So we may be having some, a little bit of neighborhood friction over Mr. Q's habit of feeding the wildlife in the backyard. I just wanted to share that fun little story with you. And of course, if you come on person on the tour, or join the live stream, you'll get to, well, on the live stream, you'll hear Mr. Q. And if you come in person, you'll meet Mr. Q. He'll be on the tour, but in your modern clothes, of course. Not the 18th century Mr. Q, the modern Mr. Q will be there. But there'll be enough of us dressed up to entertain you. So as the story goes, New York continues to be a very difficult state, right? We have our Federalists and our Anti-Federalists, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Burr and Mr. Clinton and Mr. Livingston and so many others, always arguing, undermining each other, insulting each other. And it looks like New York is just pretty useless at getting anything accomplished. But one of the things we have always been very good at, in spite of difficulties, is our society and our social life. And no matter what happens, the balls and the parties and the theater do continue in New York. And after the Revolutionary War, I would say around the year 1800, a young writer in New York started writing satire of New York society, the people in society and the social life. And he initially wrote this in a couple of newspapers under various names, but eventually he joined up with a couple friends and began writing a weekly satirical newspaper called Salmagundi. And some of you might be familiar with this. And he took on various identities in Salmagundi. And one of them was, I forgot all his pseudonyms. One of them was Lancelot. And in one issue, Lancelot compares New York's society to the Wise Fools of Gotham. And he talks about how the city, New York, being Gotham, was invaded by an army, a hostile nation, an army, and they were invaded by dancers. It was a hilarious story of how Gotham was defeated by dancers, and this being hundreds of years ago, and that this is part of the reason today that Gotham has such exquisite social life, good dancers, the best outfits, and are better than any other city in America at this, because many years ago we were conquered by a troupe of great dancers. And of course, this author, Mr. Lancelot, is referring to the Wise Fools of Gotham. And he's saying that the people of New York are indeed like the Wise Fools of Gotham, seeming to be ridiculous with our hair and our hats and our outfits and our society and our parties and our theater. And we seem so superficial all the time, and as if we care about nothing serious but going to parties and dressing up and having society, and that perhaps New Yorkers are the Wise Fools of Gotham. And I wonder if any of you know who that young man was who wrote that and gave us our name in the future, Gotham City. And it was a very great writer by the name of Washington Irving. So it was from Washington Irving that we became Gotham City, or New Yorkers being known as the Wise Fools of Gotham. Someone had it, Miss McGann had it, Washington Irving. So I wonder what you think of that. I thought that was a fun story to share on April Fool's Day, that Gotham City is all about New York being wise fools, putting on our clothes, acting ridiculous. Some of us might even say that by the time of the late 18th century, even dueling in New York had become nothing more than a show, right? As the gentlemen all had their lovely dueling pistols, and they would go to New Jersey, follow all the acts in the Code Duello, and simply shoot in the dirt or shoot over each other's heads, claiming, of course, that, oh, I was a terrible shot and I missed, but I have received my satisfaction, and now we can shake hands and go home. And indeed, I would say 95% of our duels at that time were just for show, except for a couple of very tragic ones, that being the death of Mr. Hamilton's son, Philip, and of course, the death of Mr. Hamilton himself, both of those duels being shocking, and that by that time, virtually no one was ever hurt in a duel, as everyone knew it was just a show of honor, that it was for show and not so much for real vengeance or really to kill anyone, but just to show that you had the courage to do so. There goes my hat. So I don't know. Do you think we New Yorkers are as shallow as all that? Or do you think it is just a show that we put on for everyone else so that people will think we are, while still maintaining a bit of opaqueness to what's going on behind the scenes? I can tell you, I know many ladies who come in my shop regularly, or friends of my sister, Mrs. Van R., who seem in public to be the most shallow creatures, insufferably shallow creatures, caring nothing except about their hair and their clothes and their makeup, and who was seen where, and who was with whom, and who was at whose banquet, and who was at whose salon, and who was in the theater with whom, publicly seeming to be the most shallow, ridiculous creatures, while in public with other ladies, or perhaps with gentlemen who know them well, are quite shrewd and smart and tactical in their thinking and behavior, but are very good at seeming socially to be rather senseless, or we might say sensible, or portraying themselves and their sensibility, meaning that their lives are based on their senses and their sensibility and their feelings and whatever they are thinking of at the time, rather than being rational ladies. They might pretend a sensibility. And Miss Kaler says she met shallow people in her life. It scares me. Well, there are plenty of shallow people, but there are people who pretend at being shallow who are quite clever. And I wouldn't say Mrs. Van R is one of those, but I would say that Mrs. Van R is very good at going out in society and seeming to be very not caring, very in the moment, enjoying the party, carefree, with nothing on her mind other than the society right there at the time. But I can assure you that Mrs. Van R is a very shrewd and capable lady. I'm not quite as good as that and tend to be quieter in society, as I, of course, do not want to offend any of the ladies that come in my shop. So I tend to let Mrs. Van R speak for both of us, because of course business does come first, and I want my shop to be popular. So although I might look like this in my shop and look like one of those ladies, and at times speak like one of those ladies, you all know that that is not what I am like at all. And I'm grateful to the men in my life who appreciate me, Mr. Q, of course, and my good friend, Mr. Madison, who has quite an interesting wife of his own. So do you have any questions or comments tonight? I'm going to try to keep these, to 30 minutes, unless, there's more you want to know about or more you have to say. That's fine with me, but I'd like to, keep them shorter because I don't take up too much of your time on Friday nights. I do hope I will see you on April 30th. I don't know if I'll be doing anything special before then, but I certainly will let you know if I am. And I'm hoping to do some in-person talks about my book about Theodosia Burr. And if any of those are going to be near you, I hope you'll come to see me. I'll be saying a little bit more about those and where those will be, or if they're live, I hope you'll watch as well. So thank you all for joining me tonight. And I don't have my dress made yet. I'm going to start working on my dress this weekend. So I will be updating you on my Inauguration Day dress. So please head on over to Patriot Tours NYC, support Kyle Jenks and me and the hard work we're doing to try to remember America's great past, our wonderful Constitution, a unique document that creates a very unique type of nation, unlike anything else ever in civilizational history, or modern civilizational history, I should say. So please come out or buy live stream tickets and support the work Kyle and I are doing. We're very serious about it and really want to leave behind a record for people in the future to learn about the history of our great nation. So thank you all for joining me tonight. Also, I have some comments. Mrs. McCabe, thank you. Have a great week. I know Mrs. McCabe will be joining us, Mr. and Mrs. McCabe, via live stream. So I'll be looking forward to seeing you on April 30th, Mrs. McCabe, and the rest of you as well. So thank you very much. And I will see you next week. Have a wonderful week. I hope it's spring if you're in the north, and if you're in the south, it's already summer. So thank you very much. And I'll see you next week.